as and properly as possible. And finally, we will hear from Natasha Cingotti. She's the Health and Chemicals Lead at the Health and Environment Alliance. Together with other NGOs, they work actively on EDCs, and she will present their position and expectation for info requirement under REACH for EDCs. And maybe also she will want to discuss the two options proposed by the Commission, where I understand they have a preference for option 2, but we will discuss about that. But first, I give the floor to Christina. And first, I want to thank you for your disponibility for this webinar. I know that you are really committed in these issues. So welcome and thank you very much for being here today. You have the floor.
Thank you, Maria, for this presentation and for setting the scene for the Commission work. I'm going to try to share my screen. Do you see the presentation?
Yeah, that's
yes, we see it.
Perfect, and you hear me. Perfect. So we are all set. So today I will present, as you very well introduced, the state of play of our work on the update of information requirements for identifying endocrine disruptors in relevant legislation, in particular under REACH. In this presentation, for those that were here last week, the first slides will be a bit repetitive, but I didn't know how to do it for those that were not here. So it's important to set the scene and to understand, as you very well said, Maria, that the information requirements are only one piece of the puzzle and goes hand in hand with the new hazard classes under CLP. So it all started with the communication towards a comprehensive European Union framework on endocrine disruptors that was adopted by the Commission in November 2018. Already there in that communication, we identified a number of actions that needed, and we committed to take a number of actions to improve the protection of human health and environment from exposure to endocrine disruptors. One of them was the introduction of new hazard classes, and the other one of a horizontal nature, and the other one the improvement of the information requirements, because we could have or not have the identification criteria, but if we don't have the information on the individual substances, we will not know if these substances fulfill the criteria or not. So both items have to go hand in hand. So already after November 2018, we started working on these two initiatives, one under the classification, labeling and packaging regulation, and the other one under REACH. Also, other colleagues working on a piece of legislation like biocides also worked in the update of their information requirements. So in terms of the chemicals strategy for sustainability, this was adopted in October 2020, in October last year, and it was built on extensive evaluation of all our chemical acquis, which is quite extensive in the EU. So we had a fitness check of the most relevant chemicals legislation, except REACH. We had a REACH review, and we had other many specific evaluations. We had several consultations, including a high-level conference in June 2019. And we also had a Parliament resolution and Council conclusions that we also took into consideration. And finally, on endocrine disruptors, also as a result of the communication of November 2018, the Commission performed a fitness check of endocrine disruptors, and this was part of the strategy, and it came in as a staff working document attached to the annex to the strategy. So in the chemicals strategy, we set a vision towards a toxic-free environment by 2030, where chemicals are produced and used in a way that maximizes their contribution to society while minimizing harm to the planet and to current and future generations. And how are we planning to do this? We have two overarching objectives, mutually supportive objectives, which are boosting innovation and competitiveness, and increasing protection of health and environment, and three key enablers, which are simplification and coherence, knowledge and science, and international or the global dimension. So today, we will focus on the protection measures. here it is our goal that all chemicals that are on the market are used safely and sustainably. We also want to promote substitution of substances of concern. Those are the ones that have long-term effects.
Christina, may
Yes.
I ask you, because I see the chat and people are complaining because there is this black box on your screen, on your presentation. And so if it's possible to make them.
Yes.
I don't know if it's possible for you to do something on this.
I think like this should be better.
Ah, perfect.
I think it's
perfect.
yeah.
Like this is perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very difficult to know what the others see. It depends on the program. Some programs show everything, otherwise others only show the presentation.
Like this is perfect. It's perfect, Christina.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, because it was blocking the side, the right hand side. Okay, so in terms of I was saying that we want to promote substitution of substances of concern, and the substances of concern are defined in the strategy as those causing long-term effects on the environment or on humans. And we also want to ban the most harmful chemicals from consumer products, especially having consideration of vulnerable groups. So we want to do all this building on the impressive chemical acquis that we have in the EU. So this is not a revolution, but an evolution of our legislation to make it better fit for an increased level of protection of human health and environment. We want to strengthen, in particular, REACH and CLP as the cornerstones of the chemicals regulatory system. And here is where I already mentioned we have committed to introduce new hazard classes in CLP on endocrine disruptors, and we had a session last week about this. This will allow to introduce risk management measures for the substances that have been identified as endocrine disruptors in the different pieces of legislation. And the way that the strategy is calling to do this is by using generic approaches to manage the risks associated from endocrine disruptors, and to apply these approaches to consumer products in particular. Generic approaches are a way that we have in the EU already established to regulate carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxicants, and means that on the basis of the hazard identification, we take a generic risk decision, in this case a ban, based on the generic considerations of exposure. So, for example, we have this type of legislation under cosmetics or under toys because of the uses in cosmetics products or because of the use in toys. These exposures are considered to be widespread and difficult to control because it's normally it's either consumers or vulnerable populations, and hence we have a high level of protection. We also have this approach today under REACH for consumer products, for substances and mixtures that are sold directly to the consumers. So we want to extend this approach to endocrine disruptors and other hazard classes, but today the issue at stake is endocrine disruptors. In order to also be able to use properly these generic approaches, we have introduced the concept of essential uses. So only if the use of a harmful endocrine disruptor in a consumer product is essential for health, for safety, or for the functioning of society, and if there is no acceptable alternative, it can be exempted from the ban. In addition to these actions, we will also amend Annex Article 57 of REACH to add the endocrine disruptors as substance of very high concern in their own right. Today, they can be identified as endocrine as a substance of very high concern, and we have done so under REACH for a number of substances, a fistful of substances. But we need to demonstrate equivalent level of concern to, for example, carcinogens, mutagens, and reprotoxicants. With this amendment, we will recognize that endocrine disruptors have substance of very high concern in their own right, without having to demonstrate this equivalent level of concern. Regarding the update of information requirements, I will explain more in details in the next slides. And then it's evident that part of the work is to step up the pace for developing methods to generate information on endocrine disruptors through the screening and the testing of substances. So in terms of the topic of today, which is the update of the REACH information requirements on endocrine disruptors, it had been clear in the fitness check, but also in the REACH evaluation, procedure that REACH has not been effective with regard to mandatory information requirements on endocrine disruptors. In particular, when we had concerns for some substances on their possible endocrine disrupting properties, and we looked more closely at them in the REACH evaluation procedure, we realized that there was a need for additional tests to be performed. And we had to ask the companies who had registered the substances for the new tests. But to make this test mandatory, we have to amend several of the REACH annexes. So more precisely, the REACH annexes 7 to 10, which define which tests should be performed and at which tonnage band. But also Annex 1, which details how registrants should take into account the data they have on their substances in their assessment of their chemicals, and then document it in what is called the chemical safety report. To build these new requirements, we use two important documents. One is the OECD conceptual framework for testing and assessment of endocrine disrupting chemicals. This document lists all the test methods agreed at international level for assessing endocrine disrupting properties, included in vitro and in vivo tests. And the second one is in fact an amendment of the EU regulation on biocides, in which mandatory tests for endocrine disruptors have already been introduced to assess biocidal active substances. So even if the biocides regulation does not work in the same way as REACH regarding information requirements, as I will explain later, it is still important to take this amendment into account, in particular to ensure the coherence between the two pieces of legislation. So to follow from the previous point, the REACH registration procedure is based on a tier approach according to volumes of manufacture or import of a substance, and it starts at one ton. So substances produced, manufactured, or imported below 1 ton do not require registration under REACH. And then the level of information increases as the tonnage of manufacture or import increase. So in the 1 to 10 tons, we have the lower information requirements, and in the above 1,000 tons, we have the higher information requirements. So that's what we call a tier approach. This approach is different from the biocides regulation, in which we ask, in fact, for a full data set of tests for biocidal active substances, regardless of tonnage. But for the inclusion of this mandatory test on endocrine disrupting properties in REACH, we need to reflect on which test to perform at which tonnage band, in particular for low tonnage bands, such as substances produced below the 10 tons. So in the tonnage band 1 to 10 tons per year. And we also have to balance two different objectives. We need sufficient and robust data to assess the properties of the substances, but at the same time, we should aim at reducing testing of vertebrate animals, or resort to it only as the last recourse. So we need to reflect on a number of questions. One is how to best use the in vitro test for screening and to determine whether we have to do in vivo testing. How to trigger this additional testing based on the result of the in vitro test. Can we ask the registrants to do in vivo tests? And how can we also waive some tests? If we have, for example, clear results in an in vivo test, maybe this can give enough information not to perform other tests. So currently, we only propose to include mandatory tests on what we call its modalities. These are estrogen, androgen, thyroid hormone, and steroidogenesis modalities and on vertebrates. And this is due to the current knowledge and available test methods. This is also the approach followed in the biocide legislation. But we will, of course, like to include in vitro and in vivo tests to evaluate both effects on human health and on the environment. Regarding the next steps, we developed two different options, as Maria already announced, for the update of the REACH annexes for endocrine disruptors, and already discussed them with the experts in a subgroup of the competent authorities of REACH and CLP. We also launched a study in March 2021 to gather further information in support of an impact assessment on potential options. And And the two options will be used as policy options in this study. And the timeline is to finalize the impact assessment and be able to have our formal adoption at the end of 2022, as committed to in the chemicals strategy for sustainability. So in conclusion, we have a very heavy agenda ahead of us, including also the action on the inclusion of horizontal criteria for endocrine disruptors in CLP that I presented last week. And I would like again to thank Maria Arena for inviting me today to this webinar, as well as last week, and to present this to you. And I will be happy to receive any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Christina. I'll give the floor now to Cécile Michel. And we will, if you have questions, you can put it on the chat. I see that there are some questions on the chat, so don't hesitate. So Cécile, you have the floor.
Yeah, so first I will try to share the screen with you. And hang on. Let me just, yep. I just need to find you when I have my, hang on, sorry. Here we are. Okay, do you see my PowerPoint presentation without any boxes preventing you to follow?
We just see you for the moment.
You just see me.
Yeah, now it's okay. Perfect, Cécile.
Excellent.
Now it's okay without box. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. So yeah, hello everybody, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation to present the view of the French Agency for Food, Environmental and Occupational Health and Safety. As the head of the unit of chemical assessment, I will show you how we currently identify endocrine disruptors on the REACH, the difficulties we face, and how you can improve it by modifying the annexes of REACH regulation. Hang on, I need to, yeah, here we are. So I will start my talk by showing you how we currently demonstrate that the substance is an endocrine disruptor based on the WHO definition, which is a demanding definition. So based on the WHO definition, a substance is an endocrine disruptor if 3 items are demonstrated. Data available show that the substance has an endocrine activity. You can demonstrate that this activity leads to apical adverse effects, and this relationship is based on a biological possible link. I have reported below on the slide. I don't know if you see my arrow when I point on the screen like that.
Yeah, we see it. Yeah.
You see it. Great. So I have reported below an example performed to demonstrate that bisphenol A is an endocrine disruptor. Basically, structural data of bisphenol A show that BPA can interact with receptors. And this is what we call QSAR data. And we also have interaction that are demonstrated in cellular models. Some molecular and cellular data shows that BPA interact with some enzymes such as aromatase and impact hormonal balance during the menstrual cycle of females. From that point on, we need to analyze either data from epidemiological studies. So for BPA, when we performed the evaluation, we had 13 epidemiological studies, together with 24 experimental studies in rodents. And from these studies, we were able to, even if some of them contradicted each other, we shown that BPA can affect ovulation and disturb the menstrual cycle in females. So, therefore, for BPA, we have demonstrated and we have carried on this work for 4 different apical effects affected by the same pathway to demonstrate that BPA is an endocrine disruptor for humans, while our German colleagues have performed this work on two different endpoints to demonstrate that BPA is an endocrine disruptor for environmental species. Together, this work has consisting in analyzing around 700 publications or studies. On the green part of the table here, I display the work we have performed to identify bisphenol B, which is not registered under REACH as an endocrine disruptor, and for which only 206 studies were available. From these examples show two things. First of all, that when we have strong alerts, we can overcome the lack of data from the registration dossier, or when we do not have any registration dossier, either by using the scientific literature. The number of studies necessary depends on the coherence of the data. For example, on bisphenol B, you can see that the effects were really coherent between human health and environment. And we can also overcome the lack of data by using data from substances of the same family. Indeed, if we have been able to identify bisphenol B as an endocrine disruptor, this is also because bisphenol B really looks like bisphenol A, and we used the data from BPA to help us identifying bisphenol B as an endocrine disruptor. But most of all, what these examples show is that to identify a substance as an endocrine disruptor, we need a lot of data. Well, now REACH is a regulation of registration, and regulation that has allowed so far to identify 15 substances as endocrine disruptors. As mentioned by Christina earlier on, this slide reminds you that depending on the tonnage of the substance, registrant has to provide information on the characteristic of the substance, on the effects of the substance on cells or on animal models, rodents in particular for toxicological information, and the effects of the substance on environment. Those are the toxicological information. What this table tells you as well is that we have much more substances with no to very few data than those with full registration dossier. Not talking about the quality of these studies, there is no to very few information ED related so far in the registration dossier. Therefore, to identify substances that might be endocrine disruptors or substances that fulfill the WHO definition, we use data from scientific literature. To see it in more details, the work to identify suspects, you can refer to the link presented here on the work recently carried on by Annexe. To identify the endocrine disruptors based on the WHO definition, I have prepared this slide. So this slide presents in detail the tests available so far in vitro and in vivo to test the EATS modality, also presented earlier by Christina, E for estrogen, androgen, thyroid, and steroid. So you have here the test available that would help us to fulfill the WHO definition. In green here, you have the tests that are requested for high tonnage substances in the annex so far available in REACH. In orange, you have the test that the member states, such as us, can request under substance evaluation those days. And on red, in the table, you have the tests that are available if scientists from research lab or from other international bodies have performed. So the in vitro tests informing on the molecular and cellular level are easy tests to perform and should be added in the annexes of REACH. Indeed, the annexes should be updated by adding from Annex 7, so the low tonnage substances, so adding in silico or in vitro data that will be sufficient to detect the EATS suspects. While modifying the annex, you should ensure that alerts will trigger proper additional testing. And from Annex 8 to 10, you should add higher tier studies, but most importantly, ensure that from now on, all the animal study performed will record appropriate data in terms of endocrinology. Please be aware that you will not be able to cover all the ED problematic, all the ED modalities. First, concentrate on EATS. The rest is still under construction as this, at a scientific level. So, to repeat a bit myself, so redraft the annex allowing to clue on ED properties. First, request chemicals to be screened rapidly for 4 endocrine pathways. Concentrate first on the 4 modalities for which tests are well established at the time the annex are drafted. Ensure that data requested are scientifically robust. This point could be discussed with US EPA, who have gained a lot of experience through the EDSP screening program. As not all the modalities will be covered, negative tests cannot be used as waivers. You should ensure that alerts trigger further testing. And I think it's also important to leave a room for flexibility for the authorities and or the registrant to request and or propose adapted tests. The other important message is to make the best use of the in vivo studies to be performed. As already mentioned, all the in vivo studies performed from now on should include extra reporting on ED-related information together with hormonal measurements. Factors influencing hormonal determination should be recorded carefully and taken into account while analyzing the in vivo studies. Be aware that tests are still missing to properly evaluate effects on obesity, brain development, mammary gland development, immunotox. Keep in mind the specificity of endocrine disruptors, windows of exposure, delayed effect on monotonic dose response, and also that endocrine disruption is subtle and the effects are often subtle. So there is still an issue on the statistical power of the test, in particular dealing with in vivo tests. For all these reasons and many others, it is important to point out that regulators and scientists are building a dynamic process. You are on the way to modify the annexes with the state-of-the-art of science on endocrine disruptor, but science is still evolving on that field. So to conclude, as there is rarely definitive answer in science, allow annex modifications to be a dynamic process. I would advise you to schedule a retrospective analysis on the sensibility of the in vitro test, the in vivo test, and the overall strategy you will set up. There is a current work performed at the ECA level on the OECD 443, and I think it will be very informative. Be aware that future updates will be necessary and that registration dossiers will need to be updated as long as science evolves. And I think you have also to put that in perspective with what the re-evaluation requested for the active substances under pesticides and biocide regulation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cécile. It was technical but clear, so so thank you. I will give the floor now to Natasha. Natasha, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I will try to share my screen. I think Cécile is still sharing, so I will stop. There we go. Is this working?
Yes, it is working, Natasha. We see your screen.
Perfect. So good afternoon to everybody. And thank you very much for the opportunity to provide a civil society point of view on this important issue, which we think is often very much underlooked. I'm leading the Health and Chemicals program at the Health and Environment Alliance. And for those of you who don't know us, we are an alliance with headquarters in Brussels, gathering 90 member organizations around Europe. And we work on health promotion through environmental action, which includes a big chunk of work on chemicals and endocrine disruptors. So the first question you might ask yourself is why a health protection organization is interested in the nitty-gritty of the requirements about ED information in REACH. I think the previous speakers have already very well explained the issue that we have with the REACH text and the lack of clarifications on what kind of data can be asked to registrants about ED properties. But from my perspective, what I would really like to convey today is that as long as we don't have the right requirements in the legislation for what kind of data we want to ask, the identification of EDCs will go very slowly. And if it goes very slowly, it means also that we are very slow in putting adequate control measures into place. In the meantime, substances get onto the market and people are being exposed to them without even being aware of it. And for independent scientists who are gathering knowledge and putting out new studies out there, it is very difficult to feed such knowledge into the regulatory system. So all of this contributes to what I call a false sense of safety, in the sense that at the moment, when you look at REACH, we're actually looking at a pretty narrow set of substances, and it takes us a very long time to do so, as very well explained just before. While actually what we should really look at is the rest of the iceberg that you see on my screen, which is 1,000+ potential EDCs that we know we're being exposed to. So when you look into REACH, what you see is exactly what Cécile was detailing earlier, less than 20 substances identified as EDCs under REACH through the Article 57, which Christina pointed is not really adequate for the work we are trying to do. And what is really interesting, if you look at the EU work program, there's this CORAP list that authorities are using. What you see is, in fact, almost a traffic jam of substances which have been in the pipeline for a long time, for which ED assessment is going on, but are still not being concluded. And I thought for the purpose of today's presentation, it's interesting to bring out a couple of examples of real-life substances. We talked a little bit about bisphenol A earlier, but I think it's also interesting, for instance, to highlight bisphenol S. It's on the market at the moment. We know that it's probably one of the most used replacement of bisphenol A. It's been on the ED assessment list since 2012. At the moment we're talking, the assessment is still ongoing. Same issue with one of the members of the paraben family, also very well documented by independent science, has been on the CORAP list, propylparaben, since 2015. At the time of talking, the assessment is still ongoing. Now, from a health protection point of view, that is exactly what we aim at getting fixed through the update of the information requirements under REACH. And as we move forward into really getting this no data, no market principle once and for all implemented for endocrine disruptors, I think there are two important principles that we really want to see conveyed and reflected. The first one, as noted earlier and also in last week's webinar, is that we need to consider the specificities of EDCs and the challenges that come with testing and identifying those substances. So for us, the first important thing is we know of low dose effects, which means that we cannot take for granted that low volume chemicals are not of concern. They can be. So that means that we need to start looking for ED activity potentially at an early stage of the REACH annexes from Annex 7 onwards. Likewise, we've discussed, and we all know, I think for those of us who follow the ED issue, that we are currently lacking relevant ED endpoints when we're doing testing, which means, again, as Cécile said, that sometimes we're putting forward tests at quite high levels that come out negative. They come out negative because they might not be very sensitive, they might not be parametered properly, and that doesn't mean yet that we don't have an ED at play. So The importance of expert judgment will really need to be reflected in the update of the REACH annexes, because what we see very much in ED assessment discussions is that often authorities are discussing the need to, in fact, adapt studies and add parameters and change them. And that's really what needs to be made crystal clear and possible through this update. The second very important aspect, and that might seem like stating the obvious, but we need to make better use of all the available data. I'm saying this also because there's an increasing and legitimate concern and demands to reduce animal testing, which I think everybody can support. But of course, this should never come at the expense of the protection of health and the environment. So using all the available data will also require in the annexes to make a few principles crystal clear. First of all, the fact that you can use all the independent scientific evidence that you have, and that might mean including the literature that is screening modalities beyond EATS, as Cécile was mentioning. It also needs to be very clear that you can integrate human health and environment data, because they can and they do inform each other, and authorities are trying to use them more and more together, but it needs to be made systematically possible. And the last aspect is that we need to also make crystal clear that we can indeed use the data that we have for one substance to inform the assessment of a sister compound. We were talking earlier about the bisphenols, the parabens. We need to be able to use the literature that we have for one and the other, also because when industry is registering chemicals, they do often use read across for different substances. So it needs to also be made available to authorities. Now, when we look at the actual process that has started and that Christina was detailing, as we know, the Commission has put forward a couple of proposals as part of the Caracal subgroup on endocrine disruptors, and has also announced that it will start an impact assessment very soon. Now, I think for us, NGOs, and that includes YIELD, but also partners such as ChemTrust, with whom we work closely on this, the very important thing is that the point of departure is the overall lack of data that we're facing under REACH for endocrine disruptors. And what this means in drafting the annexes is that indeed we need to make crystal clear that we integrate the latest science on predicting serious health effects. So all the literature that is beyond EATS, if necessary, at the stage of the literature screening. Then from the early annexes on, so Annex 7 onwards, we need to be able to request in vitro test batteries that inform us at least on endocrine activity. And that is necessary because at the moment for low tonnage substances, we have virtually no information on endocrine disruption. Based on this, it is very important, and I think that's really the main aspect that we've been trying to convey to the Commission in the work of the subgroup so far, is that because we're dealing with a lack of data, the annexes need to be built with triggers for new tests rather than waivers for new tests. So if we're serious about generating more data, we need to be able to always follow up on positive testing results, either in vitro or in vivo. And if we don't want to request more tests because we don't want to do more animal testing, then we also need to make it crystal clear that authorities can use a precautionary principle if they cannot conclude or if they cannot move forward. So the reason why I'm stressing this is, of course, the REACH principles that we know of, but also because we do have the chemical strategy for sustainability, in which the promise of increased protection for the environment and health is an important principle. So in the context of EDC, this needs to be translated in the update of the annexes, also because we know that EDC exposure results in health conditions and environmental effects. And in the upcoming process of the impact assessment, this is really, in our view, the principle that should be the priority. We hear about the impact assessment that will be underpinned by a cost-benefit analysis, and I have to admit that as civil society organizations, we are concerned about it. The European Court of Justice has already ruled that economic considerations are irrelevant to ED identification, and indeed, I think this is not the first priority that should be borne in mind in this exercise. So to conclude, just a few principles. As discussed earlier, we have an urgent need to generate data on ED properties under REACH. The no data, no market principle is currently not implemented properly. And that also means that the protection potential that REACH could have is currently not untapped in a way. It's also important to say that we're not requesting data for the sake of requesting data. We're requesting data because we need it to accelerate ED identification and to be able to do something once we are identifying those substances. And in the current exercise of the update, we really urge the Commission to make sure that all the latest scientific evidence on EDC effects is being integrated, and that this update can indeed really serve the goal of prevention and protection. So on this, I stop. I just added at the end of the presentation the link to the technical comments that I showed earlier, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Natasha, for your presentation. I see a lot of questions in the chat, so I will ask Basile perhaps to sum them up and try to have and ask and have this question in our discussion. I have two questions. One to Natasha, saying that you say that you prefer the trigger instead of waiver. You say that you stick to the no data, no markets. My question is, what are you doing with products that are on the markets now and not identified as this endocrine disruptor as such, not in the list of the one that are identified like that? So this is a question that I have for you. The second one is a question to Christina. It's more institutional. It's how do you see the role of the Parliament in the work you are doing? Because I know that comitology is really preferred by the Commission because it's, I think it's more, I don't know, I don't want to use, yeah, it's, you can do it more rapidly with the comitology, but you don't have this work with the Parliament. So how do you see the work with the Parliament in the different modification annex that you are doing? I know that in the annex, I think is a comitology, but it will be better to have this discussion with the European Parliament. I don't know if, Basile, you have a summary of the question that we received. If not, all the questions we will send to the participant, the question that we have in the chat, and so we can have this answer after this webinar. So, but Basile, I give you the floor.
Yes, thanks. So very quickly to all the attendees, you can also raise your hand if you want to take the floor or put any question in the chat, and we can give you the open mic to ask directly question if you want. So maybe one question that comes back a lot, so I will maybe ask this one, is about the impact assessment that is conducted. Parliament has sent also written questions to the Commission on this, and also Nina in the chat also asking a question on this, asking Christina to elaborate on the kind of questions that are being addressed in the impact assessment. And also it was mentioned in Natasha's presentation. So maybe Christina, if you want to answer to this first.
Yeah, Christina.
Yes, thank you for the question. For the maybe a first comment on Natasha's presentation as well. I don't think the court ruling that Natasha mentioned refers to the need to conduct or not an impact assessment to introduce new information requirements. I think the court, what they were saying is, when you are identifying, so it's rather applicable to the hazard classes, to the establishment of hazard classes. So when you are establishing the criteria, you do not have to take into consideration the socioeconomic consequences of those criteria, but not whether when you are introducing information requirements and that companies need to fulfill, that you don't have to look into the socioeconomic considerations. So I think there is a slight difference in the scope of the court judgment, which was at the time that came in. It was about the setting the criteria under the biocidal product regulation, if I'm not wrong. And it was a member state that took the Commission to court because they were doing an impact assessment on the setting of the criteria, not so deciding which are the parameters to decide the substance is or is not an endocrine disruptor. For us, in terms of the information requirements, we are doing a general update of information requirements, and then part of it is also the endocrine disruptors. I say this because it's not only about endocrine disruptors, it's also about all other information requirements. And I think here the strategy is very clear. We need to have information requirements that allow us to perform the risk assessment and to have the identification of hazard. And this is where the difficulty also comes with endocrine disruptors. And I wonder myself if we are really going to be able to achieve this objective fully, 100% in a sense that we are totally happy with the result. Amongst other things, because of the lack of testing, And we already see that we are focusing on a specific modes instead of looking at all endocrine disrupting. And for this, we will we'll look in the study, as I said, to the two options that we've presented to the Caracal subgroup. So the modalities are also they're very much focusing on what Natasha mentioned, is triggering and waving, and how these two come together. And this will be the basis for the impact assessment. Which questions? We haven't prepared them yet. But we'll look at how many animals are required. We will look at what is the cost of performing the test for those that have to submit the information requirements. So, but I think, let's hope we can also differentiate what is the cost associated with the endocrine disrupting information requirements and the other information requirements, because it will not only be about endocrine disruption, the update of information requirements. Maria, do you want me already to tackle your question about the role of the AP?
Yeah.
It's a dilemma, isn't it? Because we really have no problem absolutely working with the legislator. But it's also an issue of timing. So we do have the empowerment to change the annexes because they are of technical nature. And I think it's very clear in the strategy. We have a certain sense of urgency, all of us. I mean, whenever I'm discussing endocrine disruptors, it's also related to the question asked to Natasha about the substances are already in the market. The substances are already in the product. We are already being exposed to them. We have an ex-post system in the EU. We don't have an ex-ante system. We don't look at the chemicals and then we approve them for different uses. Basically, we have them on the market and then we decide whether actually, yes, there are these effects, and then we decide to ban them ex post facto. So we all have a sense of urgency, and that's the dilemma that we are having. So for me, I would actually rather like to see it the other way. Would the Parliament feel very bad and shut away if we decide to go through comitology? Because it is a very tempting option. We can advance the process by years, so we can have 2 years earlier the results in place and working. So every year counts. So I don't know
if I may, Christina, in fact, there is no difficulty with comitology when, even with the comitology, the European Parliament is a partner for this comitology. And if the position of the Commission is taking on board the concerns of the Parliament, of course, the more efficient, the more rapid response that we will have, the best it is, because I think that there is a hurry on this issue. But if sometimes the Commission is using comitology not to take on board the concerns that we have, it can be a difficulty with the European Parliament. So it is not, it's really to build a consensus on this.
Okay, clear.
Thanks. We have Jutta Guteland raising her hand, so I'll give her the floor for a live question now. Yep. Now you should be able to open your mic.
Yeah, Jutta, you have the floor.
Can you see me and hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Why can't you see me? I don't understand. I'm so sorry, but I thought you could see me too. But okay. I will talk without. If it's okay for you, is it okay for you?
Yeah, it's perfect, Jutta. Yeah, it's perfect. It's better when we see you, but if you don't have the camera on, it's okay like this.
I don't know why. Okay, but thank you for this webinar, and also thank you, Christina Davia, for giving your views and answering. I would like to absolutely agree to what Maria was saying about the comitology and also how the parliament would reason. It's the important thing is that we really have a much more careful politics when it comes to endocrine disruptors, and the situation as it is today is not fulfilling. And I also hope for the impact assessment to take into account all the science that is actually already there. I had a couple of seminars myself together with the Swedish professor Åke Bergman, who presented many studies where he can show that endocrine disruptors are in our daily life at an amount that is affecting people a lot. He studied, for example, pregnant women in a region in Sweden, and it was women who didn't work in a specific dangerous arena or anything. It was normal, they had different kind of jobs, and he studied them during their pregnancy. And then he studied the babies, and there was a significant impact depending on how much of these substances there were in the women's bodies, in their blood during the pregnancy. It was a great impact on the babies, and they could see it. So I really believe we need to have a much more careful and cautious policy towards this. And I really hope that in the impact assessment that the Commission will also include many of these studies that we already have in place, because I feel there is actually evidence and academic studies that can be used. And I have this feeling that the Commission neglected. I'm sorry, but there is already so much out there that could be used. So I would like to hear how you make sure that you get the recent studies into your work ahead of the upcoming relevant proposals from the Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Jutta. We have so many questions and interesting questions in the chat. For example, do we have to work in the grouping approach into the assessment of endocrine disruptor? We also have a question on how to finance the university to have more data, because if we need to have this data, someone has to provide it in the methodology and in the test. So it is necessary to have independent testing methodology, and so university, they have a very strong role to do on this. So we have a lot of questions like this, but we will send it to you as expert. But I will give you the floor to answer Jutta question, and we just have 2 minutes more, or perhaps 5 minutes more. So I give you the floor. I don't know if it's Cécile, Natasha, Christina. Christina, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can start, and then Cecile and Natasha can continue. And Cecile has a lot of experience on the scientific data as well. So, and what is validated, what's not validated, which tends to be an issue, with the testing requirements. And we need to always be relying on tests that are validated for regulatory purposes. So we cannot accept all type of data. But here, I think we've identified for a while the issue of the issue of availability of data, and the issue of the academic data, and how this can be used also better in assessment. And under the one substance, one assessment process, we have committed in the Commission to two things. One, that would be a legislative proposal to remove obstacles for the reuse of data, because that's something that we're also facing today, that we cannot use the data produced under certain piece of legislation in other piece of legislation. Doesn't make any sense. So we are looking into that, and for the time being, we are scoping the legislation that will fall under this initiative. The initiative is foreseen for 2023. And there is another initiative under the one substance, one assessment, which is to have a better access to academic data, or rather better use of academic data in the assessments. And for that, there is a certain boxes that need to be ticked by academic data. And we think that with a good identification of these tick boxes, but also good communication with editors, publishers, and academics themselves, so they can write their papers already with a certain being mindful of certain elements that they need to be included. It could be better used for assessments, and that's something that, as I said, we're also looking into for 2020. I think it's 2023 as well. I'm not sure, but it's not a legislative proposal at that moment. So I hope this will improve the situation.
Thank you,
Maybe,
Christina. I give the floor to Cécile, perhaps.
Yeah, I can give a quick answer on the grouping approach for evaluating EDCs. Maybe my presentation was not very clear, but it had to be very short. But the example given with bisphenol B is exactly an example of this kind of thinking. And I think also at ECAS level, we are working on the bisphenol family and on other families, exactly to avoid regrettable substitution, as it was mentioned in the chat. And based on the comment made by Jutta, we all acknowledge the fact that there is many data out there. It's much more difficult to link this kind of data with specific chemicals and then to build strong cases. And again, as presented, what I tried to show is that identifying EDCs those days based on WHO definition is a work that needs to be carried in a very systematic way. And we need, I think, at least at Annexes level, we take on board all the available data. Would they be GLP or not GLP? And we make a systematic weight of evidence approach.
Thank you. Natasha, do you want to add something?
Just a couple of points, maybe also in response to your earlier question on what do we do about the products that are on the market. I think in a way that is related also to the ongoing discussion about the update of REACH and the update of registrations, because at the moment the registrations are not updated regularly. So that is also one way this could be happening. Couple of points on the impact assessments. I think what we want to say there is what we want to see cost impacted is the difference between properly and not properly identifying EDCs. And our only worry is that the focus is on the identification as such, because of course it will cost money. And at some point it's a political decision at EU level. Do we want to identify those substances more or not? And of course, this will imply difficult discussions, costs, because tests are not coming for free. So all of this needs to be put together, and I think the protection priority needs to come first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you participating to this webinar, but also the three experts being here today to speak about this really technical issue, but really so important when it comes to protection of consumer and environment in Europe. So this is the end of the webinar, but it's not the end of our work. I think we will have to work on this in the ENVI committee and also with the different actors, the Commission, the NGOs, but also the national level. It is really important to work with your experience on the ground also at the national level. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon on this really interesting issue that is endocrine disruptor, but also the chemical strategy also. So thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thanks everybody, bye-bye.